This is Dr. Ray Dykes and the Personal Faith Program. This podcast is about the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. The background on that is that some few years after the crucifixion of Jesus, Peter and James created a Jewish sect group called the People of the Way of Jesus, based on the teachings of the human Jesus, but not based on his resurrection. But around 45 CE, Paul was on the road from Jerusalem to try to squash the people of the way of Jesus in Damascus when he had a mystical experience, a Jewish Merkabah, in which he had a conversation with a alive Jesus speaking to him from the sky. Now, Merkabah is about a close encounter with a god. A few years later, after this Merkabah experience, Paul returned to Jerusalem and told Peter and James of his experience, and they were astonished and joyful and began to spread the word that Jesus had been resurrected. Up until that time, Peter and James knew that Jesus had died and was gone, as far as they were concerned. Shortly after that, Paul shared his Damascus Road experience with his home church in Antioch. In around 60 CE, Paul arrived in Rome and shared with the people of the way in Rome his fervent belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the gospel dedicated to Mark was written in Rome about 68 to 70 CE and contained the first written account of the resurrection based on Paul's teaching. It contained the story of the tomb for Jesus being provided by Joseph of Arimathea, and the statement that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, Jesus' brother, saw where the body was laid. There were no male disciples with the women. On Sunday, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, another of Jesus' brothers, and Salome, possibly one of Jesus' sisters, went to the tomb and found the stone already rolled back, and were told by a young man, it says in Mark, that Jesus had been resurrected, and they were instructed to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in the Galilee, a region of Israel, Palestine, up north of Jerusalem. The women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, that ends the original text of the Gospel of Mark, without a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus or an ascension into heaven. Now, the shorter and longer endings of Mark were added much later, and I'll talk about them a little later. The gospel dedicated to Matthew was written in Alexandria about 73 to 75 CE. Now, in Alexandria, Egypt, they had a copy of Mark and based their resurrection story on the Mark story that was written in Rome, the Roman version. At the moment of Jesus' death, in the Gospel of Matthew, they added to Mark's account of the ripping of the veil in the temple that the earth shook and rocks were split. I'm quoting here, the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And after his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. The Arimathea tomb story is repeated with the ending that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. Again, there were no male disciples with the women in Matthew as in Mark. The other Mary is assumed to be Jesus' mother, listed 5 verses earlier as Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, also Jesus' brothers. Joseph and Joseph are the same person, just different spellings. On Sunday, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb. Now, Salome is omitted in Matthew, but there is added in Matthew an account of a great earthquake and a descending angel who rolled back the stone, as opposed to a young man in Mark. The angel told the women that Jesus had been resurrected, and they, the women, would see him in the Galilee. As the women left the tomb, Jesus appeared to them. Now, this is the first post-resurrection appearance that appears in writing. He instructed them to tell his brothers that he would meet them in the Galilee. Then this gospel, Matthew, added the story of the priests bribing the soldiers to say that the disciples stole Jesus' body, and that this story is still told among the Jews to this day. Now, this is the end of the original text of Matthew, with the one appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem and no ascension into heaven. Matthew 28:16-20 is an ending added later to this gospel, just as the endings were added later to Mark. The telling point in this being an ending added later is the inclusion of the baptismal formula, which has Jesus saying to the disciples to baptize people in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, this triadic baptismal formula, it's not Trinitarian, was probably first devised by Clement of Rome at the end of the 1st century. There's no record of Jesus baptizing anyone. Paul is said to have baptized only a few, with no mention of a baptismal formula, and Paul apologized for baptizing some of the ones he baptized. The order to go into all the world and make disciples and baptize them came from bishops in organized churches later, not from Jesus. Now, the gospel dedicated to Luke was written in Antioch about 78 to 80 CE. The scribes had copies of Mark and Matthew, the scribe is a woman in the gospel dedicated to Luke, and she based her resurrection story mainly on Matthew. She expanded the post-resurrection appearances greatly, probably because of Paul's charisma as he told the story of his Merkabah on the Damascus Road. Now, later, when she wrote Acts, she included that Damascus Road story 3 times. She changed the sequence of events at the crucifixion by moving the ripping of the curtain of the temple, not the veil, as was mentioned earlier, the curtain of the temple, to before Jesus' death. She named the women who saw Jesus laid in the tomb and who came to the tomb on Sunday morning as Mary Magdalene, Joanna, this is new, Mary the mother of James, that's Jesus' mother, and the other women with them. There were no male disciples with the women, again, nor in Mark or in Matthew. Following Mark, but not Matthew, the women found the stone already rolled away and encountered 2 men in dazzling clothes, not one, but 2. Who told them that Jesus had risen and added that Jesus had told them this would happen. The women left the tomb and told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. The scribe added that the men didn't believe the women. So Peter ran to the tomb and found it empty. The next story was added in Luke and is about the 2 apostles having an experience with Jesus on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Now, this story has a great deal in common with Paul's experience with Jesus on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus. Jesus appeared mysteriously to the men and entered into a conversation about important matters, and after a sacramental moment disappeared mysteriously. This is also a Merkabah experience, which is about a close encounter with a God. This gospel then added a story about Jesus mysteriously appearing in the midst of the 11 and their companions gathered in Jerusalem, proving to them he was not a ghost, teaching them important matters, and instructing them to remain in Jerusalem until they were, quote, clothed with power from on high, end quote. Then the scribe of Luke added the one and only account of the ascension of Jesus into heaven. This is the only place where we find the ascension. Then he led them out, it says, as far as Bethany, a suburb of Jerusalem. And lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God, end quote. That's the only story of ascension is in Luke. It's not in Mark, it's not in Matthew, it's not in John. Now, we'll get to John. The gospel dedicated to John was written in Ephesus about 85 to 90 CE. The scribe must have had access to at least one of the synoptic gospels because there is some similarity between the crucifixion accounts, but there are several inconsistencies. In one scene, Jesus is on the cross and says to his mother that John is now her son, and says to John that Mary is now his mother. Mary is a widow, and Jesus is her oldest son in charge of her well-being. Jesus was passing along that responsibility to John. This Gospel of John added John as the only male disciple present at the crucifixion. In the resurrection account in John, it was only Mary Magdalene who went first to the tomb on Sunday morning by herself. She summoned Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Interesting phrase. She summoned Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and they went into the tomb and found the death wrappings, but no body. Now, it is my considered opinion that the church of Ephesus believed that John is the son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and that it is to him that this gospel, this fourth gospel, is dedicated. John is called the disciple whom Jesus loved 4 times in this gospel. The first time at the Last Supper, where he is reclining next to Jesus and asks to be given the name of the one who would betray Jesus. The second time is at the place of crucifixion. John is there. No other male disciples are there. The third time is he was the second person to the empty tomb. The fourth time is in the Galilee later, where Jesus says that it is his will that John will remain until I come. Now, it's clear that this son, John, did what a son was supposed to do. He stayed with his father until he died. He took responsibility for his grandmother, taking her into his own home. He joined his mother, Mary Magdalene, as the first 2 at the tomb, and in the end he was blessed by his father. Now, after Peter and John left the tomb, Mary went into the tomb and encountered 2 angels. She asked them where the body of Jesus had been taken, and before they could answer her, Jesus appeared. Now, this Gospel of John then added a conversation between Jesus and Mary, ending with a request to tell his brothers that he was going to ascend to heaven. Then was added the lengthy story of doubting Thomas, which included Jesus' commissions to the disciples. Lastly, the story of Jesus' challenge to Peter is added. The blessing of John is added, and this takes place in the Galilee. There is no record of an ascension into heaven. And to remind you, in Luke, the ascension into heaven took place in Jerusalem, not in the Galilee. Now, back to the longer ending of Mark. Sometimes after the other 3 Gospels were written and circulated, an editor decided that Mark was truncated and needed post-resurrection appearances by Jesus. And so the editor copied John's saying that Jesus appeared first to Mary Magdalene only, and then added from whom he had cast out 7 demons. He copied Luke's saying that the disciples didn't believe a woman who told them that Jesus had risen. He also copied Luke with an abbreviated story of the apostles on the road to Emmaus. Now, this is an editor who has Mark and is adding to the end of it. Since the new ending of Matthew had already been added later, Matthew 28:16-20 was added before the ending of Mark, the Mark editor copied the commission to the disciples to go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation, and then added sayings about salvation and condemnation and miraculous gifts to those who believe, like playing with snakes and drinking poison and so forth. In conclusion, the editor copied Luke with a shorter version of the ascension into heaven, presumably from Jerusalem, and added that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God. Now, by the way, in a Greek legend, Zeus resurrected Dionysus and took him to Mount Olympus and seated him at his right hand. That was an old legend. Now, conclusion. That Jesus was crucified is a fact. That he was resurrected physically is a matter of faith. That he appeared to his family and to his disciples is a legend. Legends start small and grow over time. This legend of the resurrection appearances of Jesus certainly grew, and in the process of growing produced several significant contributions. I hope you have gotten some thoughts here to work on, to contemplate. If you like what you are finding on these podcasts, appreciate it, you are encouraged to make a tax-deductible contribution to the Personal Faith Program, and you can send that to 9205 Lansbrook Lane, Lansbrook Lane in Oklahoma City, 73132. Thanks for watching. Hope you'll watch another one soon.